Are we left? Okay, yeah. So thank you all for coming, and thank you, Jan, for being here. So he's going to talk to us about some of his work on Thomas Kuhn.
Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation. Great to be back here. First time I was here was, I think, 6 years ago or something. Also in the same room, if I remember correctly. But the topic of the talk today will be a bit different, so it will indeed be on Thomas Kuhn and on the work he did on the history of quantum physics between 1961 and 1984. No, let's say 1978. So I haven't added the last part in, but you can ask about that later on. And so this is work I've been doing for my current postdoc, which is almost finished. And so I'm very eager to hear all of your comments and questions and remarks, because at the moment I'm trying to turn this into a book manuscript. And so all input is more than welcome. And what I'll present today is some of the findings I've done in the Kuhn archive and some of the philosophical reflections I've done about this work. And so the starting point of the talk today is a question raised by Stefan Brush in 2000, who was a historian of science and a former student of Kuhn, in an article commemorating Kuhn as a historian of science. And the starting point is this question: why does Thomas Kuhn receive almost no recognition for the remarkable work he has done on the history of quantum physics? And so my aim today will be first and foremost to discuss what Kuhn has done on the history of quantum physics, and in the later part I'll then try to provide a first kind of tentative response to this question. First of all, what is the work that Brush is referring to, namely Kuhn's work on the history of quantum physics? It comprises more or less three different aspects. The first one, the biggest one, was a project that took place between 1962 and 1964, so immediately after the publication of The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which appeared in 1962, which was called Sources for the History of Quantum Physics, which was an enormous project, an archival and interview project that ran for 3 years, in which Kuhn, together with a few collaborators, conducted interviews and collected as many archival materials as possible, with the goal to create an archive for future historians of quantum physics to have material at their disposal. The second work that Brush refers to is an article by Kuhn, together with his former student John Heilbronn, on Bohr's 1913 atomic model. And then the third part, which is the third work, which is the most well-known, is Kuhn's book from 1978, called Black Body Theory and the Quantum Discontinuity, which handles Max Planck and early quantum physics. And so Brush claims that, look, this work by Kuhn receives almost no recognition. The first thing I want to do is this question by Brush needs to be qualified a little bit. It needs to be rephrased a little bit, because in certain parts Kuhn's work on quantum physics has received a lot of recognition, and people have recognized its significance. So, for example, oral historians may or generally see it, especially the Sources project, as the first large-scale interview project in oral history of science. And Kuhn is rightfully recognized there as having launched one of the pioneering efforts to extend oral history into history of science. So oral historians do recognize the significance of Kuhn's work. Historians of quantum physics do as well. They are especially grateful for the unseen amount of material that Kuhn and his collaborators provided to them. The archive, the materials, is still being used nowadays by historians of quantum physics to investigate particular aspects of this discipline. And what is especially important, the Sources project was in part, or in a large part, responsible for the professionalization of the discipline of history of quantum physics. So before that, it was mainly retiring quantum physicists writing the history of their own field. And because this amount of material became available, you see the emergence of people from a history or philosophy background working on the history of quantum physics. So historians of quantum physics as well state, for example, that the history of the interpretations and foundations of quantum physics has gained momentum and professional rigor since the project Sources for a History of Quantum Physics was completed in the mid-1960s. So in certain fields, Kuhn does receive the recognition that I think he does deserve. There's one exception, however, philosophers of science. They barely to none discuss this project on, or Kuhn's work on the history of quantum physics. So there's no mention, for example, of the project in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, entry on Kuhn. It's not mentioned. There's a lot of books and edited volumes on Kuhn, and specifically on structure. A lot of them do not mention the interview project. They do mention often Kuhn's book on Planck, but almost never the interview project, for example. And even in articles focusing on Kuhn and his relationship to the history of science, there's quite a lot of them, I have a whole list, where this interview project is never discussed. And so there's this big kind of gap or oversight among philosophers and even historians of philosophy of science with regards to Kuhn's work on the history of quantum physics. If it is mentioned even, that's mostly only in passing. So people point to it, say, look, Kuhn did all this kind of stuff in philosophy, and he also did this kind of stuff in history of physics, and then they just return to his philosophical work. And that has been the main reaction as well to his black body theory book. Philosophers of science said, okay, well, this seems to be a good work in history, but it's not really our concern. So philosophers of science, up until, let's say, a few years ago, did not really discuss the interview project and its relationship to Kuhn's philosophical work. And so that's my main aim of today. As of yet, there is really no study of the relationship between Kuhn's historical work and his later philosophical work. And so my aim today is in part to bridge that, to fill up that gap, and to show that there could be, or that there is stuff of interest for philosophers of science and Kuhn scholars as well in Kuhn's historical work. As of yet, there's only one real historical study of the archive project, the interview project by Kuhn, which is a book by Anke de Heesen from 2022 in German, which focuses on the interview project itself, but she does not really discuss the influence on Kuhn's later philosophical reflections. So that's my particular aim, is to see, okay, how does Kuhn's historical work relate to his later historical and philosophical work on philosophy of quantum, history of quantum physics. And my aim today is to suggest that there are aspects in Kuhn's philosophical work that are and could be relevant for understanding his later philosophical development. And then in the final part, I will try to summarize a bit what this can teach us about the relationship between history and philosophy of science and the use of interviews and empirical methods. So, small overview. So I'll start with an in-detail discussion of Kuhn and the Sources project, focusing in the first part on how the interviews were conducted, and then in the second part on Kuhn's later recollections of the project and his evaluation. In the second part, I'll then dive into Kuhn's later work on the history of quantum physics, mostly focusing on stuff that was never finished or published. And then I'll try to bridge or link that work to the work he did around the 1970s on further reflections on structure and the first criticisms that it had received. And then in the final part, I'll then wrap this all together in some reflections about the relationship between history and philosophy of science. But first, the Sources project. The first germ of the project was laying in around the end of the 1950s. So by 1955 up until 1961, all of a sudden, people who have been very active in the development of quantum physics, so Einstein, Schrödinger, von Neumann, and Pauli, all started to pass away. And so there were certain historians and physicists who realized that, look, there are still people alive, such as Niels Bohr, for example, Werner Heisenberg, and so forth, who must have a lot of recollections about what went on in the 1920s. So what we should try to do is to capture these memories, to capture their insights before they pass away as well, and then we can transform them in some kind of material for future historians of quantum physics. And so what they did in 1961 is submitted a National Science Foundation proposal for a 3-year project where the goal was, first of all, to collect as much archival materials, or at least information about where they are situated regarding the development of quantum physics. In the second place, to conduct interviews with quantum physicists who were still alive at the time, so in the 1960s, but who had conducted their main work in the 1910s, 1920s, and then to make these materials available in some way for future historians of quantum physics. The project was granted this funding, started in 1962 under the title Sources for a History of Quantum Physics, with Kuhn as the PI, the principal investigator, and then 3 assistants, John Heilbronn, Paul Foreman, and Lini Allen, who was mostly an administrative assistant. But the 2 others, so Heilbronn and Paul Foreman, later on became well-known historians of physics and of quantum physics. And so the project took place in 2 places, Berkeley, where Kuhn, Heilbronn, and Foreman were situated at the time, where they conducted their first interviews. And then the second part took place in Copenhagen at the Niels Bohr Institute, where they were granted an office by Niels Bohr himself, and where they conducted a large part of their interview with physicists from the European continent. So, but already in 1961, the project was on its way, was starting to get going, with a call for materials and information that was published in several history and physics journals. And which was also sent out personally to a lot of physicists and historians, and in which they phrased their ambitions or what they were after as follows. The project particularly desires information about letters bearing on the history of quantum physics, manuscript materials, records of meetings, photographs and films, and then the last bigger part, recollections of seminars where critical steps were discussed, of moments at which an important concept emerged, and of occasions when the outlook of one investigator was dramatically changed by another. So that was the specific focus of the project. And so from that moment onwards, Heilbronn and Foreman were primarily responsible for collecting, surveying, and copying all these kinds of materials. So that was the archival part of the project. At the same time, Kuhn was primarily focused on the interview part of the project, together with John Heilbronn. What was particularly significant about the interview project was that the interviews were meticulously prepared. So what Kuhn and Heilbronn did in the first year was go through all available materials about quantum physics and its development, compiled extensive lists of people they could interview, and for each interviewee, they read most of their publications in advance, then compiled an extensive biography and bibliography of their work, of their life, and on the basis of these materials then developed very detailed questions, focusing in particular on technical development of theories and experiments. So here, for example, we have, I think it's about half a page of the preparations for one of the Heisenberg interviews. So you see here, for example, they have a whole list of papers added, where they say, okay, in papers 5, 6, 8, 9, 11, and 12, you show an appreciable change in your apparent research interests. So they were very, very detailed questions. In total, for the Heisenberg interviews, I think they had 19 pages of such preparations, focusing on very minute aspects of their life and their research. The interviewees were then sent these preparations a few weeks in advance so that they could recollect, go back to their writings and so forth. And then the interviews themselves lasted over several days. So the Heisenberg interviews, I think there were more or less 20 days, which in the end resulted into 12 sessions, each session being 2 to 3 hours long. These interviews were then all recorded and then transcribed by Foreman and Allen and put onto microfilm, and these microfilms were then the main output of the project. So the interview transcriptions and the copied manuscripts were stored on microfilms, and this was an enormous amount of material, as I said. So in looking back on the project in 1968, Heilbronn summarized it as follows. At the close of its operation in 1964, the project had conducted and transcribed some 200 interviews with 100 informants, and had arranged microfilming of about 100,000 frames of material. It had also inquired into the holdings of 250 European archives and libraries to determine the nature and extent of pertinent material already on deposit. So it's really a big kind of archive. So that's why I said people are still really discovering new kinds of things within these. It's still being used nowadays by historians of quantum physics. So that was the main output, together with an extensive final report that Kuhn wrote together with Heilbronn and Foreman, in which they elaborated in detail their experiences with the interviewing project, how they went about, how they changed their methodology and so forth, and where they also added a manual and an index for people in order to enable them to consult these materials. Because yeah, you have a lot of microfilms, but how do you start searching what you are after and so forth. So it was really a very, very big task. And even though Kuhn and Heilbronn and Foreman stopped working on the project when it ended, there were later attempts to continue the project spirit. So there were attempts to conduct interviews also with Soviet and Asian physicists. Some people continue to search for archival materials, and even nowadays there's still an ongoing oral history project conducted by the American Institute of Physics that more or less directly came out of the Kuhn interview project. Now, this was the project itself. My main interest is in how Kuhn looked back on the project. From the start, already from the first year report, again in the final report and in his later recollections, it's clear that Kuhn was quite disappointed with the interviews. He never used the materials, for example, in his own, or almost never used materials in his own later work. The reason for this was that the interviews did not provide the expected insights. The main problem was that the interviews were conducted in the 1960s, but they were interested in very minute technical details of what went on in the 1920s. And a lot of the interviewees by that time were already in their 70s, 80s, or 90s, and just did not have that many recollections at all. So if you go back to the transcripts, there's a lot of moments where they just say, I don't know, or I don't recall, or it could be like that, or it could also be like that. So there's a lot of floating, vague memories in there, if there are memories at all. So that's the main problem that Kuhn had with the interviews, is that many interviewees just did not provide that much interesting information at all. And if they provided memories, and that's a very specific issue for Kuhn, is that because he was so well prepared in the interviews, he often immediately noticed that the recollections they provided were tainted by later events. Already in the first year report, you see him discussing interviews, saying, look, this person tells that about this experiment, but this could not be true because they're relying on sources that were only published a few years later, for example. So in the final report, I think that's the strongest statement by Kuhn on this topic. He wrote, when focusing on the technical history of physics, such questions where the interviewee said, I don't recall, were not hard to find. With a very few important exceptions, our subjects displayed only occasional and scattered recollections about the development of their own theoretical and experimental work. Memory is a sieve and not a random one. Later correct formulations tend to erase recollection of the earlier fumbling attempts. A well-prepared interviewer may find himself knowing more than his subject about the development of that subject's work. The interviews can, of course, still supply extremely significant details, but they are seldom systematic or coherent accounts of technical scientific developments. What this shows is not only that Kuhn was really disappointed with the interviews, but also that he and his collaborators had a very specific focus in mind. They were very much interested in the technical development of experiments, of theories. It's hard if you go back to the interviews, for example, you see, for example, Kuhn interviewing Heisenberg, and Heisenberg all of a sudden recounts something from the revolution in Munich in 1918, besides his work, and Kuhn just does not pick up on it. He just continues asking about a paper that Heisenberg wrote at that time, for example. So you really see all through the interview that there was this very clear focus on this epistemological side of scientific practice. This also shows in the fact that what Kuhn highlights is that a lot of memories were tainted or incomplete, but not all kinds of memories. And this is something that he himself expresses surprise about in certain points, is that even though there's little information about technical epistemological topics to be found in the interviews, there are other kinds of memories that are very clear and very well developed in the interviews, namely regarding biographical social aspects. So what the interviews do offer, according to Kuhn, is a very interesting insight, unexpected insight for him, about the relationships that the interviewees had with other students, with teachers, with how the institute or the laboratory they were working at was organized, which courses they took, how these courses went about, and so forth. And this even brought them over time to the realization that maybe this biographical social focus could lead to more insight into technical details as well. But this is something that the interviews were very rich in, according to Kuhn. So continuing the same quote from the last page, from the final report, Kuhn continues, "The same man, however, whose memory stuttered when asked to recapitulate the origin, development, or reception of a scientific concept or experiment, were often able to talk with fluency in recreating their home, school, and university lives. In the process, many of them provided a living and often a moving picture of the social and institutional milieu within which quantum physics developed. They thus supplied information of a sort that the participants themselves often take for granted, but that the historian can seldom capture in other ways." So there was certain valuable information to be found in the interviews, but it was not the information that Kuhn had expected or that Kuhn wanted to find. So that's the main later evaluation that Kuhn offers of the Sources project and its main output, namely the interviews. Now, in this part, I'll focus in detail on Kuhn's work on the history of quantum physics immediately after the Sources project had ended. So starting from 1964. What we see that is Kuhn almost immediately starts working on several different topics. So he, for example, the first lecture he gave on Niels Bohr's 1913 atomic model was already in 1964, again in 1966, 1967, and then in 1969, which was more or less a transcript of the paper he published in 1969 with Heilbronn on the development of this atomic model. Similarly, in 1965, he started giving another lecture on what he called the crisis of the old quantum theory, which was more or less the period between 1922 and 1925. So more or less right before the development of quantum mechanics as a new kind of all-encompassing theory for the subatomic level. He gave several lectures on this topic, and he even wrote a paper, more or less, which was often announced as forthcoming, but in the end was never published. Around the 1970s, 1973, he then also started working on Max Planck and the origins of quantum theory, gave several lectures about that in 1973, and this was the work that resulted in his 1978 book, Black Body Theory, which was again printed in 1987. What is interesting here as well is that Kuhn starts working on several different topics, but already in 1966, he announces that he has bigger plans as well. In a letter to the Belgian physicist Leon Rosenfeld, who was in Copenhagen at the time and who had helped Kuhn with conducting a lot of the interviews, among which with Niels Bohr, he announced that Kuhn wrote, "I now expect that I shall be going on with smallish projects of this sort for some time, but that when I feel I have explored the field sufficiently in this piecemeal way, I shall try to put together an overall survey of the development of quantum theory." So already in 1966, Kuhn had the idea to write a multi-volume series about the history of quantum physics. He even wrote an outline for this multi-volume series and sent it to a publisher in 1973. He announced 4 different volumes. The first one would be Black Body Theory, cover the first period and would be focusing mainly on the work of Max Planck, which was the one he eventually published. The second one, titled The Evolution of Quantum Conditions, would start more or less with the work of Niels Bohr, which he discussed in his Bohr paper from 1969, and would range all the way to 1923 and would focus mainly on attempts to extend Bohr's atomic model to cover different more complex molecular and atomic structures. The third one would be the crisis of the old quantum theory, covering the period 1922-1925, never published, but several lectures given on that topic. And then the final one, the fourth one, would be called Light Particles and Wave Mechanics, which would turn back in time a little bit, going from 1905-1928, and which would discuss, which would start with Einstein's work 1905 on the photon in the quantum, and which would then offer a discussion of an alternative trajectory resulting in wave mechanics by Schrödinger in 1925. So these three first volumes would focus mainly on the development of, or the historical trajectory of matrix mechanics, and then the fourth one would be focusing on wave mechanics, the alternative kind of approach to quantum mechanics that was around in the 1920s. And this plan, this multi-volume plan, was in the back of his mind at least until 1975. That's the last moment I found in the archive when Kuhn was talking about it in correspondence with his publisher, but he never got beyond the first publication. And by 1978, when the first book is published, he doesn't mention these three others anymore. So it seems that already by then he had realized this is going to be too much work, I'm not going to be able to finish any of that. But there are remnants of certain aspects of it. So there are, for example, lecture notes from one of the lectures he gave on the crisis of the old quantum theory, 1965-1966. As I said, this volume was to start with Bohr's atomic model, so how it suggests ways to quantize multi-particle systems, how this atomic model was very successful for a few years, but how it then reached its crisis moment in 1922, and how this crisis then ended in 1925 with the development of matrix mechanics. Now, if we look at these lecture notes, what is interesting is that Kuhn phrases them more or less in explicit philosophical terms. So Kuhn starts the lecture by stating, in a recent study of scientific development, namely the structure of scientific revolutions, I risk the generalization that revolutionary transformations of scientific theory are ordinarily preceded by crises, these being induced by the breakdown of previously successful problem techniques. The issue, as he goes on to say then here, is that this notion of crisis is actually quite vague in structure, and that it needs to be filled in with more detail in order to understand how crises specifically lead to revolutions. Because it's not because there are a lot of anomalies in a certain field that each of these anomalies will in the end give rise to the revolution. Some will be solved, others will just disappear, but there are a few specific kinds of anomalies that do give rise to revolutions. And Kuhn is interested in this lecture by means of his historical material to flesh out this notion of crisis in more detail. His aim there thus was to gain more insight into how scientific crises emerge, and what he argues there is that they do not emerge because of outsiders' foundational critiques. It's not by formulating abstract, critical philosophical remarks about a certain paradigm that this paradigm will come into a crisis. That's what Einstein and Schrödinger tried to do with regards to matrix mechanics, but that did not give rise to the revolution or to the crisis, according to Kuhn. Rather, it was because this field was so successful that puzzle solving in the field was driven to an extreme. People were looking for way more detail than the paradigm could ever provide, and in that way the paradigm itself stumbled over its own feet and came into a state of crisis. So it's puzzle solving, normal science, that eventually leads to anomalies and to crisis, according to Kuhn. And thus, what we see is that this lecture, 1965-1966, was explicitly formulated in response to the critics of structure, and we also see that it was in part based on his work on the sources, the interview project, and the archival project, because in the last part of the lecture, he gives quite an extensive bibliometric analysis of work in quantum physics in this period, tracing which topics people are working on and how much was published on each topic, how it evolved over time, and so forth. So there is a clear influence from the Sources project on this historical philosophical work as well. And if we look at his only remarks on what was supposed to be the fourth volume as well, which were published in the edited collection of the 1965 symposium in London, organized by Imre Lakatos and Alan Musgrave, specifically on structure. The only remarks on what was to become the fourth volume were given there by Kuhn, and in a few pages he discusses Bohr's work, so what was to become volume 2, and Einstein's work, which was to become volume 4, on the development of quantum physics. And he there sketched these as two very different traditions within quantum physics with their own aims, methods, and results. And these different traditions gave rise to two different theories that were then, in the end, seen as being formally equivalent. Namely, matrix mechanics is coming out of the Bohr tradition, and wave mechanics coming out of the Einstein tradition. Again, if we look at the context in which Kuhn discussed these topics, we see again that it was in a philosophical kind of context that Kuhn used these historical materials to make a philosophical point. His aim was namely to reply to a certain remark by Imre Lakatos about how research programs develop. And the point he raises is quite similar to the one he made in the crisis lecture, which we saw the slide before. Research programs develop first into crises and then into a revolutionary kind of state, not through critical outsider philosophical kind of approaches, but rather by solving very specific technical puzzles. In the Bohr case, these were mainly puzzles concerning the atomic structure. In the Einstein case, these were mainly questions concerning the wave and particle behavior of light. And so here as well we see how Kuhn uses his historical materials to directly address a philosophical issue, in this case namely Lakatos, and also Popper's criticism of the notion of normal science, and how he uses this historical material to further flesh out these philosophical issues or philosophical concepts that he first introduced into structure. So this was the period 1964-1966. There we see that Kuhn did use the historical material he had collected in the Sources project, that he discussed it and used it in philosophical context with quite specific philosophical issues in mind. A few years later, however, he has completely switched. From the late 1960s onward, and we can date this quite clearly, namely more or less from 1968 onwards, if we compare the different versions of the lectures he gave on these different topics. From 1968, there's no more philosophical situation. From 1968 onwards, we see that he tends to uphold a more strict division between his historical work on the one hand and his philosophical work on the other hand. There is no more explicit philosophical motivations for or philosophical terminology in his historical work. We can see this, for example, when we look in detail at the book he eventually published, but we can also see it in, for example, his paper on the Bohr atom, but even clearer in the black body theory book from 1978. The narrative he puts up there is solely historical. So the target of his book are specific historical claims made by contemporary historians at the time who had claimed that Planck had introduced the quantum into physics in 1901. That's the main target of the book. Kuhn argues in the book very extensively that Planck did not introduce the quantum in 1901. Rather, Planck was still reasoning quite classically on the basis of classical physics at that time and did not explicitly introduce anything such as a quantum into physics at that time. Kuhn argues in the book that if we want to claim that the quantum at a certain point entered into physics, then we should rather situate this around 1905, 1906. It was in the work of Einstein and Ehrenfest that it was first realized that Planck's black body theory, so the work Planck had done in 1901, in fact requires something like a quantum. Something like the idea that energy is not a continuum, but rather a discontinuous kind of collection of quantized, non-divisible units. Kuhn, however, furthermore argues in the book that even in 1905 it's difficult to make this claim that the quantum was finally introduced. Rather, he argues that, look, even though it's in their papers, this was not picked up by any kind of scientific community at the time. Both sociologically and intellectually, Einstein and Ehrenfest were at that time too far removed from the theoretical physics community. Einstein was still working in the patent office in 1905, did not have any kind of academic position, and his work was not yet that widely read. Ehrenfest, similarly in 1905, was a postdoc without any kind of funding in St. Petersburg in Russia. Nobody read his work at the time. So even in 1905, Kuhn argues in the book, there is no real claim to be made that then the quantum definitely found its way into the physics community. In the last part of the book, he then argues that the quantum was really only picked up, introduced, through connections that were elaborated by different scientists with concrete puzzles that existed in other fields in theoretical physics at the time, concerning, for example, specific heats, different forms of radiation, and so forth. It was only by making these connections that the quantum over time found its way into the community. And the pinnacle of this evolution, and so the moment where Kuhn says now we can really say that the quantum has found its entrance, is the Solvay Congress here in Brussels in 1911, when all of a sudden there is a whole congress organized around this new idea of what is this quantum at all. So it's only this historical evolution, as Kuhn sketches in the book, that really allows us to see how the quantum over time found its way into the physics community. And in a sense, we can say that the book is very close to structure in terms of topic. So we see here notions such as concrete puzzles, we see the formation of scientific communities, and so forth, but there's no more philosophical terminology to be found. And Kuhn was very explicit about this. The only paragraph where he discusses structure with regards to black body theory is in the afterword to the second edition in 1987 in reply to his critics, who all stated like, where is structure? There's no structure to be found in this book. You're writing about a scientific revolution, but you do not use the terms that you introduced in the 1960s. And there Kuhn then writes that I do my best when I'm doing history for urgent reasons not to think in these terms, so in these structure, philosophical kind of terms, when I do history. And I avoid the corresponding vocabulary when presenting my results. It is too easy to constrain historical evidence within a predetermined mold. If history, or ultimately philosophy, is to be learned from the texts that are my main sources, then I must minimize the role of prior conviction in my approach to them. Often I do not know for some time after my historical work is completed the respects in which it does and does not fit structure. And this very well aligns with Kuhn's historical work after 1968. After 1968, there's no use of the sources interviews in his historical work, and there are very, very few references to structure in any of his published materials. So in the 1969 Bohr article, there's only one, it's an article of I think around 90 pages long. There's only one reference to structure somewhere in a small footnote where he says, look, in my structure book I also discussed this topic of textbook mythology and it could apply here as well. But that's the only reference to structure in the whole work. Similarly, as I said, in black body theory, structure is only mentioned in 2 paragraphs in the afterword to the second edition. There's no structure, no philosophical terminology in these works, in these published works at all. Rather, the aim is purely historical, to complement or to challenge existing historical narratives. And as I said, in his afterword, he explicitly states that he tries to separate his historical and philosophical. And so this is what happens from 1968 onward in Kuhn's historical work. So how does this relate, this change specifically, around 1968? How does it relate to his further reflections on structure, which also took place around the time? So it's from the 1966 onwards that Kuhn really starts to engage in detail with his philosophical opponents, his philosophical critics of structure. And we can see this very clearly in the 1968 lecture he gave on the topic of history and philosophy of science. This is the first point where Kuhn, in line with his later historical publications, explicitly argues that history and philosophy are and should be kept as different disciplines. They have different aims. So the aim of history of science is to explain a particular event that has taken place in the past, whereas philosophy is, in the first place, interested in what he calls uncovering universal truths. It's a very general form of reasoning that does not really work well with these kinds of very detailed single event narratives. And you find very different discourses in history and philosophy of science. History of science offers narratives about particulars in the past, whereas philosophy of science offers this more kind of generalized, abstract form of reasoning. And he's very explicit about his idea that they cannot be practiced at the same time. So he writes in the lecture, or he states in the lecture, to train a student simultaneously in both, in history and philosophy of science, would risk depriving him of any discipline at all. Becoming a philosopher is, among other things, acquiring a particular mental set towards the evaluation both of problems and of the techniques relevant to their solution. Learning to be a historian is also to acquire a special mental set, but the outcome of the two learning experiences is not at all the same, nor, I think, is a compromise possible. And he then goes on to compare it with a kind of gestalt switch. If you want to switch from a historical to a philosophical mode, or vice versa, it's like a gestalt switch. You all of a sudden see the same event in very different ways. He does still mention here that he had not always adhered to this view, that there is this division between history and philosophy of science. So he states that it rather derives from experience as a teacher and a writer, but he doesn't really specify what his experiences have been. My hypothesis, that I still need to elaborate further, but the first formulation of the hypothesis that I would like to introduce here is that this division view derives, at least in part, from his attempts to use his historical work to intervene in philosophical debates, as he had done in 1964, 1965, in response to Lakatos, for example, about how to conceptualize crises and about the usefulness of the concept of normal science, which, as we saw, he did elaborate, or he did use his historical work at that time to further elaborate these kinds of notions. These were also the primary topics on which Kuhn was working philosophically at the time. But all these attempts to address these topics in a way that combines historical and philosophical work were either never finished, such as, for example, the Crisis lecture or the fourth volume, so on the Einstein trajectory in quantum physics, or in the end led to purely historical lectures and writings. This seems to suggest that it was indeed in part these failed attempts, so to say, that then brought Kuhn to this idea that, look, this doesn't really seem to work, trying to combine these historical and philosophical approaches at the same time. To further sharpen this hypothesis, I think it's very interesting to look at another lecture by Kuhn from the same period, namely the 1969 lecture titled Second Thoughts on Paradigms. One of the first places where he, in writing, explicitly presents his further developed ideas about, okay, which notions in structure are not that well worked out and which need further elaboration. And the one that is clearly in the center of these attempts at that time is this notion of paradigm, which has been criticized by quite a lot of people because it's too vague and all-encompassing. So Kuhn, at a certain moment, remarks that there was no index at the time for structure, but if he had an index, then it would just state paradigm, page 1 until the last page of the book. So it wouldn't be a very useful index either way. And so that was one of the points that he did acknowledge, like, look, I've used this term paradigm in part because it does give me quite a lot of leeway, but at the same time it is a very vague and all-encompassing kind of concept in structure. He then turns to one particular problem with this notion, namely that there is a possible circularity in how we defined the concept in structure. So he writes in the 1969 lecture, in the book from 1962, so in structure, the term paradigm enters in close proximity to the phrase scientific community. A paradigm is what the members of a scientific community and they alone share. Conversely, it is their possession of a common paradigm that constitutes a scientific community. If the term paradigm is to be successfully explicated, scientific communities must first be recognized as having an independent existence. And so this is the aim that he sets himself in the first part of this lecture, namely to try to develop an independent way of identifying scientific communities without any use of the notion of a paradigm. To argue that, look, we can identify in an empirical, independent way where scientific communities are, and that will then allow us to then offer our philosophical analysis of how these are constituted by what we could call a paradigm. So that's the first part of the lecture is concerned with trying to develop an independent way to identify what scientific communities are. He then argues that we can find a specific kind of methodology for identifying scientific communities, namely in the work of historians and sociologists. And he then highlights 3 specific kind of methods that historians and sociologists have used to identify scientific communities. First of all, they can conduct interviews. They can ask the scientists, okay, which kind of community do you identify yourself with? Do you see yourself as a biologist? Do you see yourself more specifically as an evolutionary biologist? Do you see yourself even more specifically as a biologist working on a specific kind of model, for example? And the answer to these kinds of questions, or we can also conduct them in terms of surveys, will give us an insight into what kind of community scientists see themselves as belonging to. Similarly, for the past, scientists can conduct literary surveys, can see, okay, which kind of shared resource materials do scientists refer to. And these can give indications about scientists belonging to a similar kind of community. Finally, we can use bibliometric methods, looking at which kind of citation patterns we can see among scientists, for example. And so bibliometry was at that time a newly emerging field within the history and sociology of science. And Kuhn was hinting at, look, we can use these methods to identify, or at least have an empirical hunch with regards to this is people forming a community. These are the historical and sociological methods that we can use to identify scientific communities. Once that work is done, we can start our philosophical job. Our philosophical job is then to account for, okay, how does this community function epistemologically? How can we account for the consensus that exists within this community? How can we account for the fact that they are able to communicate in a very fluent way among each other, even though they have very specific interpretive differences, for example? So that's the philosopher's job. That's separate from the historian's job. So here as well, we see this idea by Kuhn that there is a division between, on the one hand, the work that historians and sociologists can do, and on the other hand, the work that philosophers can do. And what is very interesting here is that the methods that Kuhn lists are exactly the methods that he used in the sources program. So he conducted interviews, he did literary surveys, and he used these bibliometric methods, for example, in the crisis lecture, and also later on in his black body theory book. And so my central claim is that it's Kuhn's work on and his experiences with the sources project that then influenced his views from the end of the 1960s onwards about how history and philosophy of science really are 2 separate kinds of practices. You have on the one hand those historical sociological methods that he had used in the sources project, in the interview and archive project, where he realized that these could not offer him any kind of epistemological insight. The interviews were not suited to obtain any kind of information about the development of theories or experiments. But they did provide, unexpectedly, insight into the biographical and social aspects of science. And so it's my claim that it's this particular experience, together with his first attempts to then use these historical methods for philosophical reflection, that in the end put him on this idea that, look, history and philosophy of science really have different aims. They use different methods and they lead to different results. Historians can use surveys, can use bibliographical methods. Sociologists can use interviews, and these can provide interesting insights with regards to the social and biographical aspects of science. But what philosophers are interested in, the epistemological aspects, cannot be gained in this way. They need to use, or they can only use different philosophical methods, which can be used or which can be employed once this historical sociological work has been done. So my central hypothetical claim, at least for the moment now, is that Kuhn was brought to see history and philosophy of science as separate disciplines as a consequence of his experiences with the sources project, and particularly with the interviews, and with his first attempts, namely the lectures and the first plans for his big book, for his multiple books around 1965, 1966, which in the end either were never concluded or led to purely historical work. That is, these 2 aspects that brought Kuhn to this, from 1968 onward, claim that history and philosophy of science are really separate kinds of disciplines. Now, to sum up, in this talk I've tried to give an overview of Kuhn's work on the sources for the history of quantum physics project. The project, as I argued, was primarily focused on conducting interviews and collecting manuscripts about the development of quantum physics from the 1900s until the 1930s. Kuhn, as I said, was very disappointed with the results because the interviews, if they could provide any insight at all, could provide very little epistemological insight. So there was nothing to be found, or very little to be found, about the development of theories and experiments. Unexpectedly, they did offer insight into another aspect of scientific practice, namely its social and autobiographical kind of aspect. But that was not what Kuhn was primarily interested in. Still, in his first attempts to work on the history of quantum physics, Kuhn then drew explicitly on specific philosophical issues that were raised with regards to structure to develop his historical work. So his focus was on puzzle solving, on crises and so forth, and he explicitly used this philosophical terminology to give shape to his historical narratives, to further flesh out these philosophical notions. However, from 1968 onward, Kuhn changed his mind and claimed that history and philosophy were rather to be seen as two separate kind of disciplines. And we can no longer find any traces of his philosophical reflections or his philosophical terminology in his historical publications, and he explicitly stated that he aimed to keep them secret because they couldn't be practiced at the same time. In his further philosophical reflections on structure, he then elaborated this claim a bit more, stating that, look, historians can use, and sociologists can use, for example, interviews, surveys, bibliometry, and so forth, which are very useful to historically or sociologically identify scientific communities, and only once this work has been done, philosophical work, epistemological analysis of these historical findings can start. Thus, Kuhn was brought to, from 1968 onward, to disclaim that history and philosophy are separate practices, and my hypothesis has been that this view was in large part influenced by Kuhn's experiences with the Sources project. Because it showed, or it convinced him, that empirical methods are limited and that they cannot provide the material required for philosophical work. Now, to return to the brush question that I raised in the beginning, or rather the qualified brush question, because as we've seen, there are certain communities that do recognize Kuhn's the significance of Kuhn's work on the history of quantum physics. But the question, as I would like to formulate it here, is why does Kuhn receive almost no recognition from philosophers of science for his remarkable work on the history of quantum physics? The hypothesis I have introduced here does suggest an answer to this question, namely that philosophers of science have not focused on Kuhn's historical work because Kuhn himself presented it as merely historical in the eventual publications. So it's because he only in the end published work that did not refer to any kind of philosophical work or philosophical terminology that philosophers of science have been able to say, okay, there's nothing of philosophical interest here if we are interested in Kuhn scholarship, for example. But I think it's important to realize what I've tried to show today is that Kuhn himself did not always see it in this way, and rather that this has only become convinced of the idea that history and philosophy are to be kept separate as a consequence of his experiences with conducting interviews and collecting archival materials for the Sources project on the history of quantum physics. And as a final kind of slide, my own kind of vague reflections about Kuhn and his views on history and philosophy of science, and a bit of my disappointment as well with Kuhn, because he goes all the way into constructing these very elaborate kind of historical narratives about the formation of quantum physics as a community, about how it was only by 1911 that we can claim that the quantum found its way into physics, and thus providing a very detailed historical narrative about how it's difficult to talk about the discovery, for example, at a certain moment in place and time of the quantum. I'm a bit disappointed that he then says, look, that's merely history, that's not philosophy. I think that for some strange reason, Kuhn is working with this very kind of strict, rigid kind of conception of what philosophy can do, and then history is something completely different. And I think, no, if you as a philosopher can offer me a very detailed kind of historical narrative about a scientific development in the past, I find that mostly to be very interesting from a philosophical perspective as well. I don't see why that would not count as conception, or why that would not count as philosophy. Why should philosophy only aim for universal abstract truths? And why should the social biographical aspects of science be of no interest to philosophers? And so that's something I still don't understand, why Kuhn made these kind of claims and did not make the more reasonable step, it seems, for me to say, okay, well, look, maybe we should do just historical kind of philosophy in a certain sense. I think, in large part, it's really his disappointment with how the interviews ended up. So that he doesn't really talk much about the interviews in his later work, but once in the few moments he does refer to it again, he always expresses his disappointment with how little the interviews can offer. But I think there as well, I think the issue is not primarily with the interview method per se. I think interviews can be a very valuable resource, and I think even as historians still show, the interviews conducted by Kuhn can be very insightful, or for all kinds of different approaches. Kuhn's disappointment, I think, is primarily with the particular way in how he practiced these interviews. As I said, first of all, they concerned events that had taken place more than 40 years earlier, and so given that a lot of the interviewees were in the 70s or 80s already, I think his expectations of what he could get with these interviews at the beginning was way too high. And a very particular point I think is important to stress is that Kuhn had a very specific technical focus. I think in part because of what he was interested in after structure, and in part also because of how the project was set up. But I think that it's in part this specific technical focus that in the end led to his disappointment. If he would have said, okay, I'll prepare myself in a lot of detail and I'll ask questions, but I'll see where the interview goes, and if Heisenberg starts talking about the revolution in Munich in 1918, okay, let's continue with this and let's see what this can gain, what kind of insight this can gain about how someone like Heisenberg conducted physics in such a politically unstable time, then I think there would be even more insightful material to be found in the interviews. So this is something I'm still working out, like in how far would I go along with Kuhn's views of what the interviews can provide, and what kind of conception of history and philosophy we can use to investigate these kinds of interviews. So yeah, that's it. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thanks. That was great. Let's have a little 5-minute break. Coffee, tea. Thanks. Okay, great. So any questions? Yeah, Alexander.
So I have difficulty to understand how Kuhn sees his own work. Because you say it sees history separate from philosophy after 68. So the paper cause and because, or because and cause it's after 68.
Mm-hmm.
The second paradigm, is it the second thought on paradigm, is it the paper also where he introduced the disciplinary matrix?
Yeah.
It's after 68.
Yeah.
So for him, these kind of paper, the cause and because are purely philosophical.
Yeah. He sees them as philosophical work. Yes, and
This is really bizarre.
yeah. So, but yeah, there is a little bit of a nuance there in the sense that he will still refer, for example, to his historical work, but for more as really kind of small cases. So you see him then, for example, one or two sentences saying something about, look, Planck in 1901 did this and this and this, and this teaches us something about the nature of conceptual change. But it's no more there's no more elaborate historical kind of narrative to be found in there. I think he really sees it as philosophical reflection, as a kind of trying to conceptualize scientific change in a very general kind of way.
Okay, but can
Yeah.
just to precise. Okay. So if something like second thought on paradigm is purely philosophical, and the disciplinary matrix is a physical thing. Okay, so he does not see how it could be understood as a framework because the disciplinary matrix, you can look at textbook, how they are transmitted, because it's much better than paradigm. It's there's at least a list of what it is, and how the teaching framed, imposed, so all that, so it's not historical, but it's not. It's theoretical, historical.
It's. I think he sees it as a kind of instrument to account for the findings of historians.
But if an historian used this concept after that to check, so if the disciplinary matrix must have framed the education system.
Yeah, so I think he would be very wary of, for example, him or someone else using these concepts in their historical work. Saying, look, here we find the disciplinary matrix, we have this and this and this and this, so the list indeed. He would be very aware of that because for him, these kinds of philosophical notions are always to be further refined by new historical findings. These historical findings can still provide data for further philosophical reflection, but we should not use our philosophical concepts in framing or elaborating our historical narratives, but because then we come to our historical work with already preconceived philosophical expectations. And that
this is exactly what he had when he did the project Source of History. He had a preconceived notion.
Yeah. I think
So he's after 68. You're saying he sees history like purely inductive. So we go.
I think so. Yeah. I think he realized
things will.
Yeah. I think he
coalesce by themselves.
I think So he would agree. I think that historians as well have their own frameworks, but we should not explicitly use our philosophical frameworks to then develop our historical narratives. And I think that's in part what he realized by looking back on his work on the Source project. And look, maybe my focus there was to not explicitly philosophical, because in the Sources project as well, there's no real mention of structure. But you see that his focus there is very much in line with how he developed his thoughts in structure. Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for your very clear talk. I think your hypothesis is very plausible, but I'm wondering what Kuhn meant by philosophy, because I think certainly not in the sense that philosophy is about broad-ranging, abstract pronouncements and things like that. You know, I don't think that Kuhn ever thought philosophy was about doing that, as you mentioned at one point. I think there are two ingredients. First, conceptual clarification. Certainly, you know what paradigm means, and so forth. But also perhaps philosophy as a kind of normative import. Because if you take the basic sense of paradigm, which is a solution of a problem, then a good solution of a problem, an actual solution of a problem, that's a normative statement. So there are, within a community of scientists, there are some solutions which are considered to be good, which are used to teach, you know, the future practitioners of the discipline. And there are solutions which are not so good, and others that are certainly not worth pursuing. So I think that's not my question. Do you think that part of trying to understand what kind of distinction Kuhn had in mind, and in his later work, you know, between history of science on the one hand and philosophy of science on the other hand, is that the second discipline, namely philosophy of science, is normative, or at least more normative, because, you know, it's a scientific practice in the first place. It's a practice. There's good practice, there's bad practice, and then philosophy certainly is not about universal norms, but, you know, norms which are adopted by some community in the scientific practice.
In part, I think he does indeed see philosophy of science as a normative kind of endeavor about conceptual clarification as well. But if you look, for example, at his still later philosophical writings, so he has a few unpublished manuscripts from the 1980s, 1990s. In which he tries to develop a very general kind of view of conceptual change in science, and where he tries to conceptualize it in an evolutionary kind of way, in terms of niche construction and so forth, and that does offer a very kind of general picture of scientific practice. So I do think that at a certain point in time. And one of the things I would like to investigate in more detail is how closely this matches Kuhn's professional trajectory. Because from the 1980s onwards, from the end of the 1970s, he then becomes professor of philosophy at MIT, no longer involved with history in any way. And then you see around this period that he starts to become more of a almost pure philosopher in this kind of very strict universalist kind of sense, where he no longer conducts any kind of extensive historical work, but where he does try to develop a very kind of generalist kind of picture of how scientific practice evolves and changes over time. So I do think that there is some sense in which he does see it, or starts to see it from this period onward, as look, philosophy is in part also about very general kind of theory development of what science and every kind of human practice, because he then develops it in a sort of linguistic kind of way, linguistic evolutionary kind of way, and there are certain points at which he says, look, this is my input, or my perspective is primarily from the philosophy of science, but this can also apply to other human practices, for example. So it does become more and more this kind of generalist endeavor as well, besides the normative and the conceptual clarification kind of aspect. Yeah. So I do think that there's this more and more universalist tendency as well in Kuhn's later work. Yeah.
Thanks. Daniele?
Yes. Thank you very much. I have a question about a very specific aspect you mentioned concerning the results of Kuhn's project. You mentioned that these interviews did not provide the expected insights, right? So you provide a lot of good reasons for these, which are very convincing and important, but beyond those, I would like to draw the attention to the possibility that there is an inherent dissociation or differentiation in the attitude the physicists exhibit while writing papers for other physicists or actually practicing science, and when asked about their work and their commitment. For example, this is something that I think we see easily in handbooks. Physics in handbooks is different from the actual practice of physics. And I think that this is very relevant, for example, for the problems associated to the realism and anti-realism debate concerning scientific entities when it comes to understand what scientists are actually ontologically committed to. And I've been reflecting a bit on this possible differentiation precisely while comparing Heisenberg's papers to what Heisenberg says in Kuhn's interview. So, did you by chance explore this aspect? Do you have any idea on how we can characterize this difference in attitude? Can we maybe see it as something connected with, I don't know, the distinction between the moment of discovery and the moment of justification or something like that?
That's a very interesting question, because indeed Kuhn in structure already is someone who explicitly warns that, look, if you look at scientific textbooks, indeed you'll find a discovery narrative that does not fit the historical kind of or the discovery trajectory that you'll find if you look at the historical sources, at the written and the written publications and the manuscripts, for example. And so you would expect them, in a sense, to already be quite critical with regards to interviews about how much insight an interview can provide. And still, he is very disappointed by what the interviews did provide in the end, which is an interesting kind of point. So Kuhn himself was also interviewed near the end of his life in the 1990s, and he does in passing mention something that is of relevance there. In the interview, he does say, like, look, already before I started conducting the interviews, I was aware that the interviews themselves could not provide like direct insight into the minds of the scientists. But he did have the expectation that by talking to the scientists, he would at least obtain certain bits of information, so to say, that when combined with the written material, could lead to new historical insights. And his disappointment was really that, look, the interviews couldn't even provide that. The only thing that the interviews really provided was either no recollections at all, scientists just saying, I don't really remember, or recollections tainted by or colored by later events. So we did have this very specific kind of expectation about, okay, interviews will not provide the direct insight into what actually happened, but if we approach them with a correct historical methodology, combine them with other sources, then we can find new historical insights. And his disappointment primarily arose from the fact that the interviews could not even provide that kind of bits of information, so to say. Yeah, I don't know if that.
So basically, he already took into account this discrepancy, this inherent discrepancy between the practice of science and how scientists would have described the practice they were involved in.
Yeah, up to a point. Because he still did have quite high expectations, I think, about, even though he realized that that the interviews would not provide ultimate information, he did still have the expectation that they could provide a lot of valuable material for further historical investigation.
Oh, sorry.
Yes.
Did he develop some specific methodological tool to deal with this discrepancy, to your knowledge? Did he have some ideas on how to practically go beyond this problem?
Yes, there was very little methodological reflection before the project on how to conduct interviews. In part also because oral history itself was really a new kind of field at that time. So there was the Columbia School for Oral History, but that was around the only department in the world at the time that was already using interviews as a historical kind of method. And especially in history of science, interviews had not been used before for these kinds of large-scale projects. So there were some historians of science who had used interviews to write out biographies, for example, but never to construct an archive, for example. So there was no real paradigm, no real example that he could follow in order to conduct his interviews. So the only real thing that they did was really prepare themselves as much as possible in advance, go through all the published papers, really write detailed historical, detailed technical questions, and then if you look at the different intermediate reports from the Sources project, you see how they over time start to realize that, look, we should not stick, for example, too much to our questions. We should use them as a starting point, but the first thing which we should strive for is really to keep the conversation going. Because if we focus too much on our questions, then scientists will block after a while. And yeah, so we should primarily keep them, let them speak. And that's the way in which we can gain as much material as possible. Whether or not it's valuable material, we'll see later on. But so you see, if you look at the different progress reports of the project, that over time they start to develop some kind of methodological insights about how the interviews should be conducted. As well in the final report, for example, so here, for example, they state that if a project, so this is the paragraph where they said, look, even though we gain little insight about technical, epistemological kind of aspects, we do gain a lot of insight into the biographical and social kind of aspects. And then they state, well, look, if a project, so we are here now, if a project of this sort were undertaken again, that orientation, so focusing primarily on the social biographical, should almost certainly be more explicit from the start. Why? Because the subject of an interview will often produce its most revealing information about technical developments within a biographical framework. Such a project might also, particularly in its first year, be restricted to interviews conducted with a very few men willing to take the time and do the work required for a full-scale autobiography. So here Kuhn is, in passing it seems, saying that, look, if I were to do it again, I would follow these kinds of methodological rules, but I haven't been able to do so. So we see, what you do see is that over time, there are these methodological realizations with regards to how interviews can and should be conducted. But before the project, there was almost none of it. So they didn't even have a way to, for example, transcribe the interviews into written text. That's something they also developed over time. Why? Because there were no examples available at the time of how to proceed for these kinds of endeavors.
Well, no, sorry, just the very last thing. To your knowledge, is this material being used in studies in sociology of science?
So, that's something I'm still working on, because one of the very practical issues is that there's no formalized or standardized way of referring to the interviews. So, in a lot of texts that I know of where they refer to the interviews, some people refer to the Sources project, other people refer to the Archive for the History of Quantum Physics, so there's already two different titles. Some people just say interview with scientist by Thomas Kuhn. Some people just say interview with on date, without any mention of the sort. So there's no standardized way of referring to the interviews, and so that makes it very difficult to do a kind of bibliographic method or bibliographic tracing of where the interviews have been used. So that's something I'm still trying to work out about how we can approach that kind of question. So I do know that it has been used in historical work quite extensively, and I do know some places in sociology of physics and the sociology of science more broadly where the archive or the sources project and the interviews have also been referred to. What you do see is that in line with Kuhn's suggestion here, it's mostly people focused on the interplay between the social and the epistemological aspects of science. So that seems as far as I know, the way in which the interviews have been most used. So for example, they're often used in historical accounts of a specific kind of research institute or a specific kind of laboratory, for example. Saying that, look, the interviews teach us about how these professors interacted with their doctoral students, how the weekly seminar sessions were organized, and how this particular organization was conductive to this kind of scientific work. So that's what the interviews have been used for, as far as I know, quite extensively. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Just to follow up to the second to last bit there, because that's one thing that how to put it? I didn't know I had sort of incorporated so many kind of contemporary historians' attitudes at such a fundamental level, but I was shocked that they were surprised by this. Right? I was shocked.
How do you mean
Yeah,
surprised by
I was shocked that they were shocked. That when you get old guys talking about their careers, they're going to talk about the history of the people they knew and the places they were.
Mm-hmm.
Like that. Maybe this is just maybe I like I say maybe I just more than I thought. Like I had learned this when I learned about history, and it really is the case that in 1962, like this was new. That they just didn't know that this is how this was going to go when they ran these interviews. But like nothing to me seems more obvious than like this is what you're going to get, guys. Like why is that? Yeah, that is
I think in part the what's playing there is the image of history of science that Kuhn was quite used to, which was primarily this very kind of Whiggish history written by the scientists themselves, this kind of discovery narratives leading to the grand, the big names in science and the big ideas. And I think that was their expectation with regards to the interviews, that they were going to expect these kinds of big narratives about in 1915 I discovered this electron model. And that was not what they got from the interviews either. And so that I think that's what really accounts for their surprise in a sense, like, oh whoa, there's this kind of thing. They can.
These were people with lives. Who had friends.
These scientists can't talk. They can provide information, but not about the details, not about the technical details. They can talk about something that we didn't really consider that much either. So I think that also in a sense connects to Kuhn's own expectations with regards to what happens when scientists themselves write history of science.
That's helpful. Thanks.
Thank you. My question is about, so you said that sort of his early historical work, also the unpublished work, is where he was explicitly philosophically framing and trying to say, look, let's just test my ideas about scientific crisis, etc. And then he abandoned this. I was just curious. I know almost nothing about history of quantum mechanics. Was it picked up later? Like other people were continuing this sort of strand and making these very philosophically sort of framed histories of quantum mechanics? Or it was a general turn of people to...
I think it's part of a general turn.
Okay.
Yeah, because if you look at, for example, so as I said in the beginning, the two main collaborators of Kuhn were John Heilbronn and Paul Foreman, and they really did history of science, history of quantum mechanics, or history of quantum physics. So there was never any kind of philosophical context or philosophical background in their historical work. And I think it's around that time, other historians of science as well, in part because of the professionalization of the discipline, It's in the 1960s that you see the first organized conferences on history of quantum physics, where you no longer have only quantum physicists themselves talking about the past, but where you have professional historians working on these topics. And then you have this abundance of source material coming in as well, and then you just see this whole new discipline just focusing on, okay, we find this interesting and we just want to find out the history of it. And the philosophical background that was still there with Kuhn in the beginning, it's no longer to be found there, I think. No, but interesting question, yeah, because so as I said, the book I'm writing, one of the chapters will be on Kuhn's own views on the history of science and situating them within the development of history of quantum physics as a discipline. That's an interesting point to further develop there. Yeah, thanks.
Yes, but I already asked the question. Is there another question? No. I have a question about the circularity problem. Did Kuhn really believe that by doing history of science and those interviews and things, he could solve the circularity problem? Because it seems to be a rather naive belief. You remember Feyerabend's quip, how do you distinguish a club of scientists from an association of sorcerers or code-safe predators, things like that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Kuhn was aware that the suggestion he makes here is not sufficient. So he says, look, this is an early development of new methodologies used by historians and sociologists. And he says, look, I do believe that in the end we will obtain purely empirical ways for identifying scientific communities. At the moment, these methods in themselves are not sufficient yet because there's a lot of preconceptions, philosophical preconceptions that do enter into those, and biases and stuff like that. So he was aware that it was not yet fully developed and not sufficiently developed, but he did think that it would be possible in the long run. And I think in part because he in the 1969 lecture, he highlights several different methods. And so you have interviews, but you also have literary surveys and these bibliometric methods. And so what you have is that historians can either talk directly with a scientist, or sociologists will talk directly with a scientist, but will also take a step back and look at the scientific community in a different kind of way, through, for example, citation analysis, or through a literary survey of the sources used, for example. And he thinks that it's really by combining these different methods that we should get some kind of empirical grip on how to identify a scientific community.
But still, you identify a community.
Mm-hmm.
You don't know if it's a scientific one.
No, yeah.
That's the
But then I think that's where I think in the end he will have to say, look, that's where the notion of a paradigm comes into play. But that defeats the purpose he has there by saying, look, you can first identify it empirically. But I think he did have at least a hope that it would eventually be possible by means of these kinds of empirical methods. Good.
I have some questions. What first struck me is that he sort of seemed to be using his own paradigm about studying scientific communities to characterize historians and philosophers of science, right?
Mm-hmm.
As sort of two different communities. I mean,
Yeah.
already talking in those kind of terms, working in different kind of objectives and paradigms. It sort of he seems to be using the same tools that he uses to study scientists to study themselves, and I think there maybe it also lies some of the reasons of this very stark distinction, which is that his position is very compatible with a sort of value-free ideal of science. So he's very sort of inductive, in his way. So he sees history as being largely inductive. There's also this issue about normativity, like, well, historians do sort of inductive sort of research, and then the philosophers do the normative stuff, and this itself is part of his own paradigm of which is largely value-free paradigm.
Not the disciplinary matrix, not the second thought paradigm. Values enter.
Yeah,
but,
values,
sorry, epistemic values enter.
Values enter there, but
okay.
yeah.
But
not full-fledged. Okay.
No,
not full-fledged, but it at least.
You can still vary or distinguish the scientific community from a societal community. So it's according to Kuhn by means of these.
Exactly, it's what I was thinking you would have answered to Michel. Is that in this paper he explicitly says no, it's not explicitly, but it's the only way to differentiate scientific from non-scientific communities. The kind of value.
Yeah.
It's not that they have values or no values.
Exactly.
The kind of values. It's the only way to enter in the normative in Kuhn.
But still very much compatible with this idea that you can define science by its values and
Certain kind of values,
very internal, right? It's the whole thing about the crisis that is not external imposed, but it's internal. And sort of if I try to link that sort of, if not value-free ideal, compatibility with the value-free ideal with his methodology. I mean, you already hinted at that, and we talked a bit in the break, that it feels like it's, if we look at the history of oral history, it's a moment where those things are not present, like you said before. It's a moment where there's a lot of criticism of this, of historicism, of history from above, and there's a bunch of people saying, no, we have to do history from below. But then they start running into this problem of like the reliability of memories. What do we do with a bunch of people have conflicting memories about particular event, and then the sort of oral history develops, and what now is memory studies. But a lot of those questions are still unanswered. I mean, a lot of people. I did oral history of science, and I can understand those frustrations. It's very difficult because on the one hand, if you learn everything about that person's scientific history, then you already go with a specific kind of question, and you run into these issues of knowing more than the other person, which is good but also bad, because you already start sort of placing your understanding into theirs. So it's difficult, but it feels like, for me, what is at the center is that he is, at least for our generation of historians, like if for us, those of us working in the sort of values in science, it seems that he's sort of the beginning of having sort of started this notion that the values are in science. Yeah. But he's also very much
like the right value.
At the very beginning, also very much sort of compatible with this sort of older idea. So that's why of this sort of ambiguity of his image in many of his.
I think that's a very interesting. It's indeed, as I said, it's one of the first attempts to do oral history in the history of science kind of way. And there were not that many examples, except for, as I mentioned, the Columbia Oral History kind of project. And if you look at, so Kuhn is in these kinds of, so this quote I had in the beginning, for example. This one, for example, what I did is a kind of, low-scale kind of survey of histories of oral history to see, okay, where do they mention Kuhn and how do they mention them? Do they mention the project? And everywhere he's recognized as a kind of pioneer, but in a lot of places it's also pointed out that, look, the project was very much in this kind of elitist kind of way. So who are the people they interviewed? The big names. Heisenberg, Bohr, Dirac, all these kinds of big... So and I think in total they did 100 interviews, and I think 1 in 5 was the people who had at least one Nobel Prize. There's five women, and I think there's one person who wasn't a physicist, or a few of them. They interviewed a few wives of physicists, and also the personal secretary of Niels Bohr. But for the rest, it was only it was very Europe-centered as well. only males in their white males in their 70s, and so later on they did realize it. So later on there were some, as I said, there were some attempts to interview, for example, Bose in India or Soviet physicists. So there was a kind of realization that, look, we have conducted this project, but there are underlying biases, so to say. But still, yeah, for all kinds of reasons, this didn't really take off. But it's true that, yeah, it was at a moment where this field was for the first time in a kind of formation, and Kuhn had already very elaborate ideas about how to study science, and yeah, you really clearly see it in the interview project. Also with regards to the question, then, okay, how would Kuhn distinguish a community from a scientific community? In the end, he would indeed appeal to the epistemic values as the scientific kind of values, but that's not really a response, no, because that presumes that you already know what scientific values are. And I think that's in line with his response, for example, to later developments in sociology of science, where you have the SSK movement in the 1970s, 1980s, saying that, look, sociologically there's no difference to be made between parakinetics, parapsychology and nuclear physics, for example. And Kuhn would say, no, this is not what we're doing. We do have a kind of preconception of what science is, what science should be, and you really clearly see it in how the interviews were conducted as well. In part because there were no examples to be followed, methodological examples that would make them more attentive to which kind of biases would be playing. In part, I think as well, because Kuhn himself had quite elaborate views already about what science was and how it should be studied because of structure. And I think, for example, with regards to this particular aspect, also in part because of societal factors. So Kuhn was not able to conduct any kind of interviews with people working in East Germany, for example, or with people working in the Soviet Union because of the political and geopolitical situation that was around at the time. So the project in itself, its output is shaped by all these kinds of different factors, and I think that's why people then sometimes I get the question: okay, can we still use the interviews to gain insight into what happened in the 1920s? And I think maybe if you situate them correctly and you see that they are in the first place documents from the 1960s. That they are shaped by this very particular context in which Kuhn and others were conducting them. Thanks.
I have a thought. To come back to Charles' point, one of the reasons they were so disappointed, disappointed to some extent by the interviews, is that Kuhn always believed, I think, that a characteristic of science that was a progressive enterprise, was progress, and they expected to find out in their interviews how quantum mechanics progressed, how they came to give you insight about quantum phenomena and so on. I don't know.
I think that's neat. That there was definitely an expectation that there would be elements in their interviews that could put them often in a few places Kuhn elaborates in more detail, for example, why he saw a particular interview as problematic. And what you often see is that in his preparations he came across, for example, the Bohr interview, which is his most famous example, or one of the Bohr interviews, which was one of his most famous examples of an interview where there were this issue of tainted memories. So in the 1913 Bohr paper, Kuhn had studied it in detail, and he came to the conclusion, look, there are two different, inconsistent kind of atomic models here, actually. There are certain claims that Bohr ascribes to the atom that are incompatible with claims he makes later on in the same interview. And this Kuhn took as evidence, suggesting that Bohr had actually developed an earlier model that in the end didn't work out completely, and that he then reworked into the model that eventually became the model he published in 1913. And that was one of the questions that he then asked to Bohr in the interviews, because he wanted to obtain indeed insight into this kind of progress moment. But Bohr in the interview just said, no, I just made a mistake there, this cannot be true, no, I never had any kind of earlier model. And Kuhn insisted, like, no, but it's there, look, there's an interesting historical insight to be gained there. And Bohr just says, no. And then he recounts at a certain point that the interview is finished, and Bohr immediately turns to his assistant and says, silly questions. No. But then, in the 1969 paper on Bohr and the atomic model, by that time in their archival interview they have found manuscripts with an earlier atomic model. So yeah, so you do indeed see that Kuhn was really into these kinds of moments where there's some kind of friction and he's in the historical material and says, okay, these cannot work at the same time, so there has to be a kind of earlier moment where this first one was present, and then we make this progressive kind of step to the next point. And that's the point, the step he was interested in. And that was what he was after with for example, the Bohr interview as well. And I think indeed that's part of his frustration, that if you look at how the call for materials was formulated, especially this fifth point, this really screams structure. Like, we want to gain insight into these almost gestalt kind of switches, in these moments of progress. We want to develop historical narratives about how these critical steps were undertaken. And so that's really what he was after with the interview, these kind of progress moments where things really fundamentally change. And I think that's indeed, part of his frustration, that the interviews could not provide that anymore. Interesting point.
Daniele?
I have another question which comes from a problem raised by Harald Wilche in a recent paper about the use of qualitative methods especially in phenomenologically inspired philosophy of physics. And Wilche says that in phenomenology of science, the things themselves are the expert experiences practicing scientists undergo as part of their scientific practice. Since most phenomenologists are not practicing scientists, they fail to describe their respective expert experience and hence the things themselves. So apparently the problem here is that there is an apparent incommensurability, if we want to use a Kuhnian term, between the view of the philosopher who, like Kuhn, studies the scientist experience and the experience of the scientist himself, due to the different mindset, different expertise. Also in the case, the philosopher himself has some kind of scientific education. Does this aspect emerge from the analysis of Kuhn's project? Do you think that cases like Kuhn's enterprise can be privileged domains to study the problems arising from this difference in attitude?
I think so, yes. One aspect, it's mostly a hunch. It's not fully worked out, but I think that so in structure, for example, Kuhn still uses quite a lot of psychological vocabulary to characterize what he calls, for example, the Gestalt switch, what he then calls a scientific revolution. Yeah, sure. And that seems to suggest that he still sees it as something very much taking place in the scientist's experience, in the experience of the scientists themselves. And I think, but that's something that needs to be worked out further, but in his later work he seems to quite radically abandon this kind of phenomenological or experiential or psychological kind of way of characterizing conceptual change, and really focuses more on changes in the scientific community, in the context in which scientists were working. And so you then end up with narratives such as, for example, Planck, who in a sense did start at least a change, a conceptual change, but without realizing it himself. As Kuhn said, Planck in 1901 or thought at least that he was reasoning completely classically. If we look back, it's at that moment that in the end things started to get rolling, that in the end resulted in 1911 the introduction of the quantum in the physics community. So we have this more detached kind of perspective in Kuhn's later work. And I think in part that's also possibly a consequence of his interview experience. That in the beginning of the interviews he still had the expectation that the interviews could provide insight into these kinds of experiential kind of moments, and that by the end, or let's say 10 years later, he realized that no, the only way in which we can really understand what's happening behind these moments is if we not look in the first place at the scientists' phenomenology or their experiences themselves, but rather at the broader context, the community and so forth in which they are working. So I think that but that's something that needs to be fleshed out further, that there is a kind of change in Kuhn's views or attitude as well in that regard. Yes. The Wiltshire paper is a new paper, right? Or
yeah, it is.
I saw it last week.
Actually, I don't know if it's already published because I read the manuscript.
I think I saw it pass by somewhere last week or something, and as announced as forthcoming. So good. Thanks.
So just to be sure that I understood your point, because it's an important point. In the structure, even in the second edition, it's full of perception, perceive, people see different things.
Mm-hmm.
All that disappear, this language,
Not
and later Kuhn.
I'm not sure complete. I'm not sure
At
whether
least most of it.
I'm not sure whether it disappears completely, but indeed it's less prominent.
Okay.
So I think there is a switch in his later work more to the scientific community as the primary carrier of, or the primary place where scientific change, conceptual change takes place. And this psychological experiential kind of description at least goes more to the background.
Okay.
Yeah, I think so.
So he evolved.
Yeah, but I cannot.
Even if you dislike him.
No, I don't dislike him. No,
He evolved.
but I cannot avoid seeing him through the eyes of himself. Through the eyes of paradigm shift, and like him also being at sort of thinking in classical history terms, like he was thinking of
believes in
Planck.
scientific progress. He's already gone for you.
No, but at the same time, he does put on some seeds that will later become what history of science is today. So in a way, he's what Planck is for the history of physics.
It's fascinating because indeed, if you look at the history of lab ethnography, for example, or the use of interview methods, he's rightfully recognized as a pioneer for all these methods that then later on become standardized or more or less standardized methods in sociology of science, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Similarly, around the end of the 1960s, he's doing computer simulations of linguistic change as one of the first people to really use computers in order to simulate how concepts can diverge and change over time. So it's interesting that he indeed still has what we call or what we could consider a very classical kind of view of science as an epistemological practice that is more separated from the rest of society, where progress is still possible. But then he's at the same time developing these methods that over time would lead to these radically different kind of views of how science or scientific practice works.
And that interpretation sort of prove himself, right? Because we are all explaining this development in terms of his methodology. We haven't brought in political factors to explain that change, or not much.
Yeah.
So we explain mostly in terms of sort of his epistemical crisis that he faced with the sources. So in a way, it does vindicate some of his internalist claims.
We're Kuhnians in the sense that we are all philosophers among each other,
Yeah.
focusing in the first place on the epistemological part, and then we say, we can also bring in the societal aspects, for
Well,
example.
I was thinking of a very similar, pretty tight paradox. Like, it's funny that Kuhn opens structure by saying, what a change you would get in philosophy of science if it took the history of science seriously. And it's funny that it seems like that's exactly Kuhn's problem. Like, he couldn't realize how different philosophy of science really could be. He's like, so then in the end, philosophy of science, we're going to make, universal theories like Popper and Lakatos did. That's what we'll do forever, right? And it's like, well, that's not what we'll do forever. Actually, we'll find other things we can do later on.
It's fascinating.
And just one curious question: that picture that everyone knows about Kuhn, can you put it again?
Are you going to ask? I was going to ask.
What's
one?
with the double?
I think
and
it's
triple?
a photo taken. I think there's a window here, and he's on the other side, but I'm not sure. So I don't really know what the history is of this photo. It's on Wikipedia. It's everywhere.
It's everywhere, right?
Yeah.
But there's more. Is there more of him? Is there another repetition?
I've never seen another photograph.
I don't know whether there is like a full or kind of picture with more repetition. Well, you see here that
there's more Kuhns, right?
Yeah.
So if we are in the silly question region, is it true that he threw an ashtray to Errol Morris, the famous?
I don't know. I wasn't there. But so for people who, I don't know whether everybody's familiar with the story. So at a certain point in time, Errol Morris, who was to become a famous film director, was a student of Kuhn in Princeton, I think, in the History and Philosophy of Science department. And Morris criticized Kuhn very harshly in a later book where he called him like the instigator of postmodernism. And he also tells a story that Kuhn at a certain point in time did throw an ashtray at him because they were disagreeing about some kind of discussion. So I don't know whether it's true. There is a paper by I think it's either Brad Ray or Juha Satsi, where I think it's Brad Ray, where he argues that look, there's a lot of reasons to believe that it's not a completely true story. But so the interesting thing is that there are letters from Kuhn where he discusses. So I think it's in the context of a colleague of him asking about how was your class this year? What kind of students do you have? And so he discusses a lot of students, and one of them is Errol Morris, and he does describe him as really difficult. I don't know the exact formulation anymore, but he does describe him as a very difficult kind of student who had who didn't have Kuhn's classes were very difficult because what he did was just 12 weeks of full-blown primary text reading of the sources of the history of quantum physics, for example. So starting with Planck all the way up to Heisenberg and Schrödinger, reading week after week. And he did expect you to carry out all the calculations and stuff like that. Because if you look at his reading notes itself, there's pages and pages of unmarked or like uncontextualized calculations of the papers he himself read. And his classes were like that as well. And Morris is one of the students that he does pick out in his correspondence saying, look, he doesn't have the background that is fitted for this kind of class. He didn't have any previous scientific or physics studies or stuff like that. So there was a kind of tension between the two, but I don't know whether he threw an ashtray or not.
But you're just giving more matter to Max because he was teaching history internally. Do the calculation.
No, but I'm not. Well, we can have it. We can discuss over here.
But that,
It's
okay.
So, thanks.